From smartphones to cars, supercomputers, and home appliances, home desktops to enterprise servers, the Linux operating system is everywhere. Linux has been around since the mid-1990s and has since reached a user base that spans the globe. Linux is actually everywhere. It's in your phones, your thermostats, in your cars, refrigerators, Roku devices, and televisions. It also runs most of the internet, all of the world's top 500 supercomputers, and the world's stock exchanges. But besides being the platform of choice to run desktops, servers, and embedded systems across the globe, Linux is one of the most reliable, secure, and worry-free operating systems available. Here is all the information you need to get up to speed on the Linux platform. What is Linux? Just like Windows, iOS, and macOS, Linux is an operating system. In fact, one of the most popular platforms on the planet, Android, is powered by the Linux operating system. An operating system is software that manages all of the hardware resources associated with your desktop or laptop. To put it simply, the operating system manages the communication between your software and your hardware. Without the operating system, OS, the software wouldn't function. The Linux operating system comprises several different pieces. 1. Bootloader, the software that manages the boot process of your computer. For most users, this will simply be a splash screen that pops up and eventually goes away to boot into the operating system. 2. Kernel, this is the one piece of the whole that is actually called Linux. The kernel is the core of the system and manages the CPU, memory, and peripheral devices. The kernel is the lowest level of the OS. 3. Init system, this is a subsystem that bootstraps the user space and is charged with controlling daemons. One of the most widely used init systems is systemd, which also happens to be one of the most controversial. It is the init system that manages the boot process, once the initial booting is handed over from the bootloader, i.e., GRUB or Grand Unified Bootloader. 4. Daemons, these are background services, printing, sound, scheduling, etc., that either start up during boot or after you log into the desktop. 5. Graphical server, this is the subsystem that displays the graphics on your monitor. It is commonly referred to as the X server or just X. 6. Desktop environment, this is the piece that the users actually interact with. There are many desktop environments to choose from: GNOME, Cinnamon, Mate, Pantheon, Enlightenment, KDE, XFCE, etc. Each desktop environment includes built-in applications, such as file managers, configuration tools, web browsers, and games. 7. Applications, desktop environments do not offer the full array of apps. Just like Windows and macOS, Linux offers thousands upon thousands of high-quality software titles that can be easily found and installed. Most modern Linux distributions, more on this below, include App Store-like tools that centralize and simplify application installation. For example, Ubuntu Linux has the Ubuntu Software Center, a rebrand of GNOME software, which allows you to quickly search among the thousands of apps and install them from one centralized location. Why use Linux? This is the one question that most people ask. Why bother learning a completely different computing environment, when the operating system that ships with most desktops, laptops, and servers works just fine? To answer that question, I would pose another question. Does that operating system you're currently using really work just fine? Or, do you find yourself battling obstacles like viruses, malware, slowdowns, crashes, costly repairs, and licensing fees? If you struggle with the above, Linux might be the perfect platform for you. Linux has evolved into one of the most reliable computer ecosystems on the planet. Combine that reliability with zero cost of entry and you have the perfect solution for a desktop platform. That's right, zero cost of entry, as in free. You can install Linux on as many computers as you like without paying a cent for software or server licensing. Let's take a look at the cost of a Linux server in comparison to Windows Server 2016. The price of the Windows Server 2016 Standard Edition is $882 USD, purchased directly from Microsoft. That doesn't include client access license, calories, and licenses for other software you may need to run, such as a database, a web server, mail server, etc. For example, a single user cal, for Windows Server 2016, costs $38. If you need to add 10 users, for example, that's $388 more dollars for server software licensing. With the Linux server, it's all free and easy to install. In fact, installing a full-blown web server, that includes a database server, is just a few clicks or commands away. Take a look at Easy LAMP server installation to get an idea how simple it can be. If zero cost isn't enough to win you over, what about having an operating system that will work, trouble-free, for as long as you use it? I've used Linux for nearly 20 years, as both a desktop and server platform, and have not had any issues with ransomware, malware, or viruses. Linux is generally far less vulnerable to such attacks. As for server reboots, they're only necessary if the kernel is updated. It is not out of the ordinary for a Linux server to go years without being rebooted. If you follow the regular recommended updates, stability and dependability are practically assured. Open source. Linux is also distributed under an open source license. Open source follows these key tenets. The freedom to run the program, for any purpose. The freedom to study how the program works, and change it to make it do what you wish. The freedom to redistribute copies so you can help your neighbor. The freedom to distribute copies of your modified versions to others. These points are crucial to understanding the community that works together to create the Linux platform. Without a doubt, Linux is an operating system that is by the people, for the people. These tenets are also a main factor in why many people choose Linux. It's about freedom and freedom of use and freedom of choice. What is a distribution? Linux has a number of different versions to suit any type of user. From new users to hardcore users, you'll find a flavor of Linux to match your needs. These versions are called distributions, or, in the short form, distros. Nearly every distribution of Linux can be downloaded for free, burned onto disk, or USB thumb drive, and installed, on as many machines as you like. Popular Linux distributions include Linux Mint, Manjaro, Debian, Ubuntu, Antergos, Solus, Fedora, Elementary OS, OpenSUSE. Each distribution has a different take on the desktop. Some opt for very modern user interfaces, such as GNOME and Elementary OS's Pantheon, whereas others stick with a more traditional desktop environment. OpenSUSE uses KDE. You can check out the top 100 distributions on the DistroWatch. And don't think the server has been left behind. For this arena, you can turn to Red Hat Enterprise Linux, Ubuntu Server, CentOS, SUSE Enterprise Linux. Some of the above server distributions are free, such as Ubuntu Server and CentOS, and some have an associated price, such as Red Hat Enterprise Linux and SUSE Enterprise Linux. Those with an associated price also include support. Which distribution is right for you? Which distribution you use will depend on the answer to 3 simple questions. How skilled of a computer user are you? Do you prefer a modern or a standard desktop interface? Server or desktop? If your computer skills are fairly basic, you'll want to stick with a newbie-friendly distribution such as Linux Mint, Ubuntu, Figure 3, Elementary OS or Deepin. If your skill set extends into the above average range, you could go with a distribution like Debian or Fedora. If, however, you've pretty much mastered the craft of computer and system administration, use a distribution like Gentoo. If you really want a challenge, you can build your very own Linux distribution, with the help of Linux from scratch. If you're looking for a server-only distribution, You will also want to decide if you need a desktop interface, or if you want to do this via command line only. The Ubuntu server does not install a GUI interface. This means two things: your server won't be bogged down loading graphics, and you'll need to have a solid understanding of the Linux command line. However, you can install a GUI package on top of the Ubuntu server with a single command like sudo apt-get install ubuntu desktop. System administrators will also want to view a distribution with regards to features. Do you want a server-specific distribution that will offer you, out of the box, everything you need for your server? If so, CentOS might be the best choice. Or, do you want to take a desktop distribution and add the pieces as you need them? If so, Debian or Ubuntu Linux might serve you well. Installing Linux. For many people, the idea of installing an operating system might seem like a very daunting task. Believe it or not, Linux offers one of the easiest installations of all operating systems. In fact, most versions of Linux offer what is called a live distribution, which means you run the operating system from either a CD/DVD or USB flash drive without making any changes to your hard drive. You get the full functionality without having to commit to the installation. Once you've tried it out, and decided you wanted to use it, you simply double-click the install icon and walk through the simple installation wizard. Typically, the installation wizards walk you through the process with the following steps. We'll illustrate the installation of Ubuntu Linux. Preparation: make sure your machine meets the requirements for installation. This also may ask you if you want to install third-party software, such as plugins for MP3 playback, video codecs, and more. Wireless setup: if necessary, if you are using a laptop or machine with wireless, you'll need to connect to the network in order to download third-party software and updates. Hard drive allocation: Figure 4. This step allows you to select how you want the operating system to be installed. Are you going to install Linux alongside another operating system, called dual booting, use the entire hard drive, upgrade an existing Linux installation, or install over an existing version of Linux? Location: select your location from the map. Keyboard layout: select the keyboard for your system. User setup: set up your username and password. That's it. Once the system has completed the installation, reboot and you're ready to go. For a more in-depth guide to installing Linux, take a look at how to install and try Linux the absolutely easiest and safest way, or download the Linux Foundations PDF guide for Linux installation. Installing software on Linux. Just as the operating system itself is easy to install, so too are applications. Most modern Linux distributions include what most would consider an app store. This is a centralized location where software can be searched and installed. Ubuntu Linux, and many other distributions, rely on GNOME software. Elementary OS has the App Center, Deepin has the Deepin Software Center, OpenSUSE has their App Store, and some distributions rely on Synaptic. Regardless of the name, each of these tools do the same thing: a central place to search for and install Linux software. Of course, these pieces of software depend upon the presence of a GUI. For GUI-less servers, you will have to depend upon the command line interface for installation. Linux is a family of open-source Unix-like operating systems based on the Linux kernel, an operating system kernel first released on September 17, 1991, by Linus Torvalds. Linux is typically packaged as a Linux distribution, which includes the kernel and supporting system software and libraries, many of which are provided by the GNU project. Many Linux distributions use the word Linux in their name, but the Free Software Foundation uses the name GNU/Linux to emphasize the importance of GNU software, causing some controversy. Popular Linux distributions include Debian, Fedora Linux, and Ubuntu, the latter of which itself consists of many different distributions and modifications, including Lubuntu and Subuntu. Commercial distributions include Red Hat Enterprise Linux and SUSE Linux Enterprise. Desktop Linux distributions include a windowing system such as X11 or Wayland, and a desktop environment such as GNOME or KDE Plasma. Distributions intended for servers may omit graphics altogether, or include a solution stack such as LAMP. Because Linux is freely redistributable, anyone may create a distribution for any purpose. Linux was originally developed for personal computers based on the Intel x86 architecture, but has since been ported to more platforms than any other operating system. Because of the dominance of the Linux-based Android on smartphones, Linux, including Android, has the largest installed base of all general-purpose operating systems, as of May 2022. Although Linux is, as of November 2022, used by only around 2.6% of desktop computers, the Chromebook, which runs the Linux kernel-based Chrome OS, dominates the US K-12 education market and represents nearly 20% of sub-$300 notebook sales in the US. Linux is the leading operating system on servers. Over 96.4% of the top 1 million web servers operating systems are Linux, leads other big iron systems such as mainframe computers, and is used on all of the world's 500 fastest supercomputers, since November 2017, having gradually displaced all competitors. Linux also runs on embedded systems, i.e. devices whose operating system is typically built into the firmware and is highly tailored to the system. This includes routers, automation controls, smart home devices, video game consoles, televisions, Samsung and LG smart TVs, automobiles, Tesla, Audi, Mercedes-Benz, Hyundai, and Toyota, and spacecraft, Falcon 9 rocket, Dragon Crew capsule and the Perseverance rover. Linux is one of the most prominent examples of free and open source software collaboration. The source code may be used, modified, and distributed commercially or non-commercially by anyone under the terms of its respective licenses, such as the GNU General Public License, GPL. The Linux kernel, for example, is licensed under the GPL v2, with an exception for system calls that allows code that calls the kernel via system calls not to be licensed under the GPL. Thank you for watching this video. For more videos like this, please subscribe and comment below.